10 men of God, who built empires on lies, promising divine miracles while stealing millions from desperate believers. These weren't ordinary criminals. They were spiritual leaders who exploited the most vulnerable people in society, the sick seeking healing, the poor hoping for prosperity, and the desperate clinging to faith as their last hope. From a $65 million private jet purchased for God's work to fake AIDS cures that gave dying patients deadly false hope, these religious fraudsters bilked their followers out of hundreds of millions of dollars. They turned prayer into profit, miracles into manipulation, and houses of worship into elaborate crime scenes, where faith became the weapon of choice. Welcome to Savage Case Files. Today we're exposing 10 preachers who turned houses of worship into houses of fraud, betraying the sacred trust placed in them by millions of believers worldwide. Unlike typical criminals who steal money or property, these men weaponized faith itself, making their betrayals even more devastating to victims who had given them their hearts, souls, and life savings. We'll take you inside scandals that rocked the religious world, from staged healings using hidden earpieces to violent miracle services that left followers injured. From fake kidnappings covering up affairs to survival food scams targeting the elderly. Each case reveals how these wolves in sheep's clothing used sophisticated psychological manipulation to exploit humanity's deepest spiritual needs. These preachers didn't just commit fraud, they perverted the very concept of divine intervention, turning desperate prayers into personal profit margins and sacred trust into criminal opportunity. Their cons fooled millions, until investigative journalists, skeptics, and brave whistleblowers finally exposed the truth behind their so-called miracles. From coast to coast, and spanning nearly a century, these religious cons demonstrate that some of the most dangerous criminals wear clerical collars and speak in tongues while picking pockets and breaking hearts. Hit subscribe to never miss our investigations into betrayals that shattered the trust of millions, where faith meets fraud and divine promises become criminal schemes. Case 1. Creflo Dollar. Creflo Dollar was a smooth-talking Georgia mega-church pastor who built a religious empire worth hundreds of millions by promising his followers that God wanted them to be wealthy, while he lived in luxury mansions and flew in private jets funded by their donations. As the founder of World Changers Church International, Dollar preached the prosperity gospel with such conviction that desperate believers emptied their bank accounts to support his lavish lifestyle. Dollar had mastered the art of religious manipulation, teaching his congregation that their financial struggles were caused by lack of faith and insufficient giving to his ministry. He promised that seed offerings would multiply into miraculous financial breakthroughs, convincing struggling families to donate money they couldn't afford, while he accumulated massive personal wealth through their sacrifices. His congregation watched him live like a king while they remained trapped in poverty. But Dollar always had a religious explanation for the disparity. He claimed that his wealth was proof of God's blessing, and that followers could achieve the same prosperity by increasing their donations and demonstrating greater faith in his teachings. In 2015, Dollar's shameless greed reached new heights when he launched an audacious campaign, asking his followers to fund a $65 million Gulfstream G650 private jet. He claimed that commercial flights hindered his ability to spread the gospel worldwide and that God had specifically commanded him to acquire this particular aircraft for his ministry. His shameless request would expose the ultimate greed behind prosperity preaching when he asked struggling congregation members to contribute toward an aircraft that cost more than most people would earn in multiple lifetimes. Dollar justified the outrageous expense by claiming that flying commercial was too dangerous and that he needed the jet to reach more souls for Christ. The request sparked immediate national controversy and ridicule from media outlets and the general public, who were horrified by the audacity of asking poor believers to fund such an extravagant purchase. Social media exploded with criticism as people shared stories of Dollar's congregation members living in poverty, while their pastor demanded millions for personal luxury. Media scrutiny revealed the full extent of Dollar's lavish lifestyle, including multiple mansions, luxury cars, and expensive jewelry, all funded by donations from followers who often struggled to pay basic bills. Investigative reports showed how Dollar had accumulated massive personal wealth while preaching that financial hardship was a sign of spiritual failure. Facing overwhelming public pressure and negative publicity, Dollar eventually withdrew the Jet fundraising campaign, claiming that critics had misunderstood his motives. However, he continued living his luxury lifestyle and maintained his prosperity gospel teachings, showing no genuine remorse for exploiting his followers' faith for personal gain. Dollar continues his ministry today despite ongoing criticism and financial controversies, serving as the ultimate symbol of religious greed and the exploitation of faithful believers who trusted him with their spiritual and financial well-being. Case 2. Clarence McClendon. Clarence McClendon was a charismatic Los Angeles prosperity preacher who built his ministry by targeting financially desperate congregation members with promises of wealth miracles in exchange for large donations. Operating primarily in low-income communities throughout the 2000s, McClendon perfected the art of exploiting economic desperation through sophisticated religious fraud that left his followers deeper in poverty while he accumulated personal wealth. McClendon had discovered that desperate people would give their last dollar if convinced that God would multiply their sacrifice into financial abundance. He developed a ministry model that specifically targeted struggling families, single mothers, and elderly believers on fixed incomes, people who could least afford to lose money but were most vulnerable to promises of divine financial intervention. His services followed a predictable pattern of emotional manipulation designed to extract maximum donations from vulnerable attendees. McClendon would stage elaborate healing ceremonies and present fabricated testimonies from congregation members who claimed to have received miraculous financial breakthroughs after making large donations to his ministry. The staged healings were particularly cruel, as McClendon would plant actors in his audience who would dramatically claim to be healed of various ailments during his services. These fake miracles were designed to build credibility and convince genuine believers that McClendon possessed divine power that could transform their financial circumstances as easily as he appeared to heal physical ailments. His promises of prosperity would leave followers deeper in poverty, as he used high-pressure tactics to convince them that their financial struggles were caused by insufficient faith and inadequate giving. McClendon taught that God was testing their commitment through their willingness to donate money they couldn't afford, creating a vicious cycle where financial hardship was blamed on spiritual failure. Former staff members eventually revealed the systematic nature of McClendon's fraud, exposing how testimonies were fabricated and healings were staged using coached participants. These whistleblowers described a ministry operation that functioned more like a criminal enterprise than a religious organization, with detailed plans for extracting money from vulnerable believers. The investigation revealed that McClendon had developed sophisticated methods for identifying and targeting the most financially vulnerable members of his congregation. He would use personal information gathered during prayer requests and counseling sessions to craft personalized appeals that exploited individual financial crises and family emergencies. Despite facing multiple investigations and mounting evidence of fraudulent practices, McClendon managed to avoid major prosecution through legal technicalities and the difficulty of proving criminal intent in religious contexts. The First Amendment's protection of religious expression created legal challenges for prosecutors attempting to hold him accountable for his exploitation of believers. McClendon's case demonstrated how prosperity gospel preachers could systematically exploit economic desperation in vulnerable communities while hiding behind religious freedom protections. His ministry served as a blueprint for other fraudulent preachers who learned to weaponize poverty and desperation for personal profit while avoiding serious legal consequences. Case 3. Aimee Semple McPherson. Aimee Semple McPherson was a charismatic 1920s Pentecostal evangelist who pioneered modern religious broadcasting and built a massive following through her claimed miraculous powers and theatrical healing services. As the founder of the Foursquare Church and operator of her own radio station, McPherson had become one of America's most famous religious figures, promising divine healings and supernatural interventions to desperate followers across the nation. McPherson had revolutionized religious entertainment, combining Hollywood-style theatrics with traditional revival meetings to create spectacular shows that drew thousands of believers seeking miraculous cures. Her Angelus Temple in Los Angeles became a pilgrimage destination where the sick and desperate came hoping for divine intervention that McPherson claimed to channel through her special anointing from God. Her ministry generated enormous wealth through donations from followers who believed her promises of miraculous healing and divine favor. McPherson lived lavishly while preaching about spiritual sacrifice, maintaining multiple residences and expensive wardrobes that contradicted her messages about worldly renunciation and holy living. In May 1926, McPherson's carefully constructed religious empire faced its greatest crisis when she disappeared while swimming at Venice Beach, California. For weeks, her followers held prayer vigils and search parties scoured the coastline, believing their beloved evangelist had drowned or been kidnapped by enemies of her ministry. Her miraculous reappearance would be exposed as elaborate deception when she emerged from the desert claiming to have escaped from kidnappers who had held her captive in Mexico. McPherson's dramatic story of abduction, torture, and heroic escape captivated the nation and initially generated sympathy for the seemingly victimized evangelist. However, police investigation quickly revealed inconsistencies in her kidnapping story that suggested a far different explanation for her mysterious disappearance. Detectives discovered evidence that McPherson had actually been hiding with her married lover, radio engineer Kenneth Ormiston, in a romantic getaway that she needed to conceal from her religious followers. The investigation uncovered hotel records, witness testimonies, and physical evidence that contradicted McPherson's kidnapping claims and pointed to an extramarital affair that would have destroyed her ministry if revealed. Her supposedly miraculous survival became a scandal that exposed the hypocrisy behind her religious empire and moral teachings. The case became a national media sensation, as newspapers across the country covered every detail of the investigation and trial. McPherson faced perjury charges for lying to authorities about her disappearance, but managed to avoid conviction through skilled legal maneuvering and the difficulty of proving her deception beyond reasonable doubt. Despite the scandal, McPherson managed to rebuild her ministry and continue her religious career, though her credibility was permanently damaged. Her case pioneered techniques later used by modern televangelists to exploit religious faith while living double lives that contradicted their public moral teachings. The kidnapping hoax demonstrated how religious leaders could manipulate public sympathy and media attention to cover up personal scandals, establishing patterns of deception that would be repeated by fraudulent preachers for decades to come. Case 4. Jim Bakker. Jim Bakker was a disgraced former megachurch pastor who had already served prison time for defrauding his PTL ministry followers in the 1980s, but his taste for religious fraud proved incurable. After his release, Bakker rebuilt his ministry and discovered new ways to exploit believer trust, this time targeting fears about end times and natural disasters to sell fake miracle products to vulnerable audiences. Bakker had learned nothing from his previous conviction and prison sentence, instead viewing his legal troubles as persecution that validated his calling to continue exploiting religious faith for personal profit. He established a new television ministry that focused on apocalyptic prophecies and survival preparation, targeting elderly viewers who were terrified about societal collapse and natural disasters. His new scam involved selling survival miracle food buckets and healing water that he claimed would provide divine protection during end times catastrophes. Bakker promised that these overpriced products contained special properties that would sustain believers through apocalyptic events, while protecting them from disease, starvation, and other disasters. The food buckets were marketed as containing miraculous sustenance that would last for decades and provide complete nutrition during emergency situations. Bakker claimed that God had revealed special preservation techniques that made his products superior to ordinary emergency food supplies, justifying prices that were dramatically inflated compared to similar products available elsewhere. His return to fraud proved that prison had taught him nothing about exploiting faith when he began targeting a new generation of vulnerable believers with the same manipulative tactics that had landed him in federal prison decades earlier. Bakker used his television program to create fear about impending disasters while positioning his products as divinely inspired solutions. The healing water scam was particularly cruel, as Bakker claimed that ordinary spring water became miraculous through his prayers and special blessing ceremonies. He sold bottles of this supposedly blessed water for enormous markups, while claiming it could cure diseases and provide supernatural protection against illness and contamination. Federal regulators and state attorneys general eventually investigated Bakker's product claims and found them to be fraudulent and overpriced. The FDA determined that his survival food contained no special properties and was simply repackaged emergency rations sold at inflated prices to exploit consumer fears about disasters. Legal action followed as multiple lawsuits were filed against Bakker for false advertising and consumer fraud. State regulators found that his products were dramatically overpriced compared to similar items available through legitimate emergency preparedness companies, with markups of several 100% justified only through false miracle claims. Despite facing renewed legal scrutiny, Bakker continued his fraudulent practices and maintained his television ministry, demonstrating the persistent nature of religious fraud and the difficulty of preventing repeat offenders from exploiting new victims. His case showed how disgraced religious leaders could rebuild fraudulent ministries by targeting different vulnerable populations with updated scams. Bakker's pattern of deception spanning multiple decades illustrated how religious fraudsters repeatedly exploit believer trust, using different crisis scenarios and miracle claims to justify the same underlying goal of extracting money from vulnerable followers who place their faith in fraudulent spiritual leaders. Case 5. Ernest Angley. Ernest Angley was a flamboyant Ohio-based televangelist who built his massive following by claiming divine power to cure terminal diseases, including AIDS and cancer, during an era when medical science offered little hope for patients facing these deadly diagnoses. Operating from his Grace Cathedral in Akron, Angley promised miraculous healing to desperate families who had exhausted all medical options and were willing to try anything to save their loved ones. Angley had perfected a theatrical healing style that combined dramatic prayer sessions with emotional manipulation, designed to convince audiences that he possessed supernatural abilities. His healing services attracted thousands of desperate people seeking divine intervention for conditions that doctors had declared incurable, making him enormously wealthy through donations from families facing terminal diagnoses. During the height of the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s and 1990s, when the disease was essentially a death sentence, Angley claimed that prayer and faith could accomplish what medical science could not. He promised HIV-positive patients that his healing services could cure their infection, giving dying people false hope while extracting money from families already devastated by medical expenses. His false promises would give dying patients deadly false hope as he convinced them to abandon medical treatment in favor of his prayer sessions and faith-healing ceremonies. Angley taught that continued illness was evidence of insufficient faith, creating a cruel cycle where patients blamed themselves for their deteriorating condition rather than recognizing his fraudulent claims. Medical professionals who investigated Angley's ministry found no verified cures, despite his claims of healing thousands of patients over several decades. Doctors who treated patients from his services reported that many had worsened after discontinuing medical care to pursue Angley's faith healing, with some dying unnecessarily due to delayed or abandoned treatment. The investigation revealed a pattern of exploitation that specifically targeted families facing terminal diagnoses, when people were most vulnerable to promises of miraculous intervention. Angley's ministry developed sophisticated methods for identifying and approaching patients with life-threatening conditions, offering false hope in exchange for substantial donations. Former staff members eventually came forward with allegations of physical and emotional abuse within Angley's ministry organization, describing a toxic environment where questioning his healing claims was forbidden and dissent was met with punishment. These whistleblowers revealed how Angley maintained control through intimidation and manipulation of vulnerable followers. Angley's healing services were particularly cruel because they targeted people who were literally dying and had no other options, exploiting their desperation and fear of death to extract money while providing no genuine medical benefit. His expensive healing sessions often cost families their life savings during the most difficult period of their lives. Despite facing multiple investigations for fraud and abuse, Angley managed to avoid major prosecution due to the difficulty of proving criminal intent in religious healing contexts and the protection afforded by First Amendment religious freedom provisions. His case highlighted the legal challenges of prosecuting faith healers who exploit medical desperation. Angley's ministry contributed to unnecessary deaths of patients who abandoned proven medical treatments for his false promises of divine healing, demonstrating how religious fraud can have fatal consequences when it interferes with legitimate healthcare decisions during medical emergencies. Case 6. Marjoa Gortner. Marjoa Gortner was a child evangelist who began performing staged miracles at age 4. Trained by his parents to deceive audiences through elaborate religious theatrics that would fool millions of believers over several decades. Born into a family that saw religious fraud as a lucrative business opportunity, Gortner learned to manipulate congregation emotions and fake divine healing before he was old enough to understand the moral implications of his deception. Gortner's parents had discovered that audiences were particularly susceptible to religious messages delivered by children, viewing young preachers as pure vessels for divine communication. They trained their son in sophisticated performance techniques, teaching him how to read crowds, manufacture religious ecstasy, and create the illusion of miraculous healing through psychological manipulation and stagecraft. By his teenage years, Gortner had become one of America's most famous child evangelists, drawing massive crowds to revival meetings where he performed what appeared to be supernatural healings and divine revelations. His youthful appearance and apparent innocence made his religious claims more credible to audiences who couldn't imagine a child being capable of such elaborate deception. For decades, Gortner traveled the revival circuit, performing fake healings and religious theatrics that generated enormous profits for his family and ministry organization. He had mastered every aspect of religious fraud, from identifying vulnerable audience members to creating dramatic healing scenarios that convinced skeptical observers of his supernatural abilities. His shocking confession would expose the dark reality behind child evangelism when he agreed to participate in a 1972 documentary that revealed the fraudulent nature of his entire ministry career. Gortner allowed filmmakers to record his revival meetings while explaining the psychological techniques and stagecraft methods he used to deceive audiences. The documentary Marjoa showed viewers exactly how faith healers manipulated religious emotions and created false miracles through careful preparation and performance skills. Gortner demonstrated how he could induce religious ecstasy in congregation members, stage dramatic healings, and extract large donations through emotional manipulation and psychological pressure. Behind-the-scenes footage revealed the cynical reality of revival meetings, showing how Gortner and his associates would research audience members beforehand, plant confederates in crowds, and use information gathered from prayer cards to create the illusion of divine revelation during services. The Academy Award-winning documentary exposed techniques that had been used by fraudulent preachers for generations, revealing how religious con artists exploited human psychology and spiritual desperation to create convincing performances that appeared genuinely supernatural to believing audiences. Gortner's confession damaged the credibility of the entire revival movement and provided a blueprint for understanding how other faith healers operated their fraudulent ministries. His willingness to expose the industry's secrets gave investigators and skeptics valuable insights into the methods used to deceive religious audiences. The revelation became a cautionary tale about the exploitation of children in religious settings, demonstrating how young people could be trained to participate in elaborate fraud schemes that damaged both their victims and their own psychological development through years of systematic deception. Case 7. Todd Bentley. Todd Bentley was a heavily tattooed Canadian evangelist who claimed that God had commanded him to physically assault people during healing services, promoting miracle healings through kicking, punching, and violently attacking congregation members who came seeking divine intervention. His bizarre ministry combined religious fraud with physical abuse, creating one of the most disturbing examples of faith-healing deception in modern history. Bentley had developed his violent healing methods after claiming that angels had appeared to him with specific instructions to use physical force during prayer sessions. He taught his followers that God sometimes required aggressive physical contact to break through spiritual barriers and release miraculous healing power, justifying brutal attacks on vulnerable people as acts of divine love. His 2008 Florida revival, known as the Lakeland Healing Outpouring, attracted thousands of desperate believers seeking miraculous cures for serious medical conditions. The event was broadcast internationally and drew visitors from around the world who had heard reports of spectacular healings and supernatural manifestations occurring under Bentley's ministry. During these services, Bentley would violently kick elderly people in the stomach, punch disabled individuals in the face, and physically assault sick children while claiming that his aggressive actions were channeling God's healing power. Audience members who questioned his methods were told they lacked faith and were hindering the miraculous work that God wanted to accomplish. His violent methods would leave followers injured while promising divine healing, as medical professionals who examined participants found no verified healings despite Bentley's claims of curing cancer, raising the dead, and restoring sight to the blind. Instead, many attendees suffered additional injuries from his physical assaults during prayer sessions. The investigation revealed that Bentley's staff members had coached healing testimonies and fabricated miraculous cure stories to maintain the illusion that his violent methods were producing supernatural results. Former associates described a systematic process of creating false testimonies and suppressing reports of injuries caused by Bentley's aggressive healing techniques. Medical experts who studied Bentley's methods found them to be not only ineffective but actively harmful to participants, particularly elderly and disabled individuals who were most vulnerable to injury from his violent approach. Several attendees required medical treatment for injuries sustained during his healing sessions. The revival collapsed when personal scandals emerged involving Bentley's moral failures and allegations of abuse within his ministry organization. Former staff members revealed that Bentley had been living a double life while promoting his violent healing methods, engaging in behavior that contradicted his public religious persona. Legal issues followed as multiple lawsuits were filed by injured participants, and fraud investigators examined his ministry's financial practices. The cases highlighted the dangers of unregulated religious healing practices and the potential for physical harm when spiritual authority is combined with violent behavior. Bentley's ministry exposed the extreme lengths to which fraudulent healers would go to maintain their deception, demonstrating how religious authority could be used to justify physical abuse while exploiting the desperation of people seeking miraculous intervention for serious medical conditions. Case 8, Robert Tilton. Robert Tilton was a Texas televangelist who built a massive religious empire by promising miraculous financial breakthroughs to viewers who sent vow of faith donations to his ministry. A former insurance salesman who had discovered the profit potential of religious broadcasting, Tilton developed one of the most cynical and systematic religious fraud schemes in American history, exploiting desperate believers while providing absolutely no spiritual services in return. Tilton had perfected the art of religious manipulation through his television program Success and Life, where he promised viewers that God would multiply their donations into miraculous financial windfalls. His smooth delivery and apparent sincerity convinced millions of struggling families to send money they couldn't afford, believing that their sacrificial giving would trigger divine intervention in their financial circumstances. The cornerstone of Tilton's fraud was his promise that he would personally pray over every letter and prayer request sent to his ministry, claiming that his intercession would bring about miraculous breakthroughs for faithful donors. He taught viewers that their financial struggles were caused by insufficient giving, and that larger donations would demonstrate the faith necessary to receive God's blessing. His sophisticated mail operation extracted millions of dollars from vulnerable believers, while providing no genuine spiritual services whatsoever. Tilton's ministry employed dozens of workers whose sole job was to process incoming mail, extract cash and checks, and dispose of the prayer requests that donors believed would receive personal attention and divine intervention. In 1991, ABC's Primetime Live conducted an investigation that would expose the shocking reality behind Tilton's Prayer Promise ministry. Hidden cameras and investigative reporters discovered that prayer letters were being systematically discarded in dumpsters behind Tilton's ministry headquarters, while donations were processed and deposited into ministry accounts. While followers waited for promised miracles, their desperate pleas were literally thrown away, as the investigation revealed thousands of unopened prayer requests in garbage containers, many containing heartbreaking appeals for help with terminal illnesses, financial crises, and family emergencies that Tilton had promised to address through prayer. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Prayer requests were sorted only for money, with letters containing cash or checks processed for financial information, while the actual prayer requests were discarded without being read. Tilton's promise of personal prayer and divine intervention was revealed as a complete fabrication designed solely to extract donations. The exposé showed viewers exactly how their faith had been exploited, with hidden camera footage of ministry workers throwing away prayer requests while counting money. The investigation revealed that Tilton had accumulated enormous personal wealth through this systematic deception, living in luxury while his followers remained trapped in the financial desperation that had driven them to seek his help. Following the broadcast, Tilton faced multiple lawsuits and IRS investigations into his fraudulent practices. His television ministry lost most of its broadcast slots, as stations refused to carry programming from someone exposed as a religious fraud. And his financial empire collapsed under the weight of legal challenges and public outrage. The case became a landmark in exposing religious fraud and demonstrated how investigative journalism could protect vulnerable believers from systematic exploitation by fraudulent spiritual leaders who weaponized faith for personal profit. Case 9. Benny Hinn. Benny Hinn was a Palestinian-born evangelist who built a worldwide ministry empire on promises of miraculous healings, claiming that his special anointing allowed him to heal any disease through massive crusades that attracted desperate believers from around the globe. His theatrical healing services combined religious spectacle with sophisticated fraud, creating one of the most profitable faith-healing operations in modern history. Hinn had mastered the art of religious theater, staging elaborate healing crusades in massive arenas where he would dramatically wave his jacket and claim that people were being healed throughout the audience. His charismatic personality and apparent supernatural abilities convinced millions of sick and desperate people that attending his crusades could provide the miraculous cure that medical science had failed to deliver. His healing services followed a carefully rehearsed format designed to create maximum emotional impact and extract large donations from vulnerable attendees. Hin would make sweeping claims about healings occurring throughout the venue, encouraging people to believe they had been cured while soliciting substantial financial contributions to support his worldwide ministry. The deception involved staging miracle healings using planted audience members and coached testimonies that created the illusion of supernatural intervention. Former staff members revealed how Hin's organization would recruit people to provide false testimonies about miraculous cures, while genuine sick people who attended his crusades received no actual healing despite his dramatic promises. Behind the spectacular healings lay a carefully constructed web of deception, as investigations revealed the systematic nature of Hin's fraud and the lack of verified medical cures, despite decades of healing claims. Medical professionals who studied his crusades found no documented cases of genuine miraculous healing, despite thousands of claimed cures over his career. Multiple media exposés revealed how Hin's organization fabricated healing testimonies and suppressed reports from attendees who remained sick after his services. Investigative journalists discovered that many people who appeared on stage claiming to be healed were actually ministry employees or coached participants who had never suffered from the conditions they claimed to be cured of. The investigation showed that Hin had accumulated massive personal wealth through donations from desperate families seeking miraculous intervention for terminal illnesses and chronic conditions. His luxurious lifestyle, including private jets and expensive homes, was funded by contributions from people who often bankrupted themselves trying to access his healing services. Former associates described a ministry operation that functioned more like a business enterprise than a religious organization, with detailed strategies for maximizing donations and maintaining the illusion of supernatural healing power. These whistleblowers revealed how Hin's staff would research audience members and use gathered information to create convincing displays of divine revelation. Despite overwhelming evidence of fraud and numerous investigations, Hin continues his ministry today, demonstrating the persistent nature of religious deception and the difficulty of holding faith healers accountable for their exploitation of vulnerable believers seeking miraculous intervention. His case damaged the credibility of the entire faith-healing movement and exposed how charismatic religious leaders could exploit human desperation on a global scale while accumulating enormous personal wealth through systematic deception of millions of vulnerable followers. Case 10. Peter Popoff. Peter Popoff was a charismatic German immigrant who built a massive faith-healing following by claiming direct communication with God during miracle services, appearing to possess supernatural knowledge about audience members' personal lives and medical conditions. His apparent ability to receive divine revelations about strangers in his audience convinced thousands of desperate believers that he possessed genuine prophetic powers and could channel miraculous healing. Popoff had developed a ministry style that seemed to demonstrate undeniable supernatural abilities, as he would call out specific names, addresses, and medical conditions of people he had never met before. Audience members were amazed when he would accurately describe their health problems and personal circumstances, viewing this apparent divine knowledge as proof of his connection to God. His healing services drew massive crowds of sick and desperate people who had heard reports of his miraculous abilities and supernatural knowledge. Popoff would walk through audiences calling out detailed information about attendees' lives, creating an atmosphere of religious excitement and convincing skeptics that they were witnessing genuine divine intervention. The elaborate deception involved using hidden radio earpieces to receive information about audience members from his wife, Elizabeth, who would gather personal details from prayer cards and relay the information to Popoff during services. This high-tech fraud allowed him to create the convincing illusion of supernatural revelation while actually using electronic communication equipment. What appeared to be divine revelation was actually high-tech fraud when skeptic James Randi began investigating Popoff's ministry in 1986. Randi's team used radio frequency monitoring equipment to intercept the electronic communications between Popoff and his wife, discovering that his apparent supernatural knowledge came from hidden earpieces rather than divine inspiration. The investigation revealed that Elizabeth Popoff would collect prayer cards before services and radio detailed information about audience members to her husband through a wireless communication system. Hidden cameras captured Popoff receiving electronic transmissions while pretending to receive divine revelations, exposing the technological foundation of his apparent miracles. Randi's exposé was broadcast on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show, reaching millions of viewers who watched in shock as the electronic deception was revealed through recorded radio transmissions. The broadcast included audio recordings of Elizabeth Popoff feeding information to her husband, proving that his supernatural knowledge was actually sophisticated fraud. The ministry collapsed overnight after the exposé aired, as Popoff's credibility was completely destroyed by the undeniable evidence of electronic deception. His followers abandoned him in massive numbers once they realized that his apparent divine abilities were actually the result of hidden technology and systematic fraud. Despite the devastating exposure, Popoff eventually returned to televangelism, targeting elderly and desperate viewers through late-night television programs that promoted miracle healing products and prayer services. His comeback demonstrated the persistent nature of religious fraud and the ability of exposed charlatans to rebuild their operations by targeting new, vulnerable populations. The case became a landmark in exposing religious fraud and demonstrated how modern technology could be used to create convincing illusions of supernatural power, while also showing how investigative techniques could reveal the truth behind apparently miraculous phenomena. Across these 10 cases spanning nearly a century, disturbing patterns emerged that reveal the systematic nature of religious fraud and the consistent methods used to exploit vulnerable believers. These preachers didn't operate in isolation. They followed remarkably similar playbooks for manipulating faith, extracting money, and avoiding accountability, while building personal empires on the suffering of desperate followers. The primary targets were always the most vulnerable members of society. Terminally ill patients seeking miraculous cures, impoverished families hoping for financial breakthroughs, elderly believers on fixed incomes, and desperate parents facing family crises. These fraudulent preachers developed sophisticated methods for identifying and approaching people during their most vulnerable moments, when critical thinking was compromised by fear, desperation, and hope. Geographically, these operations concentrated heavily in Bible Belt states, where strong religious traditions created large populations of potential victims who were culturally predisposed to trust spiritual authority figures. The concentration in areas with deep religious heritage provided these fraudsters with built-in credibility and reduced skepticism from local communities and law enforcement. The evolution of fraud techniques paralleled advances in technology and media, progressing from simple stage tricks in the 1920s to sophisticated electronic deceptions and mass media manipulation by the 1980s. Modern fraudsters like Popoff used hidden earpieces and radio communication, while others like Tilton exploited television broadcasting and direct mail systems to reach millions of potential victims simultaneously. Financial impact reached hundreds of millions of dollars, stolen from vulnerable believers over the decades, with individual victims often losing life savings, homes, and medical treatment funds to these schemes. The true cost extended beyond money to include unnecessary deaths from abandoned medical treatment, psychological trauma from shattered faith, and family destruction from financial ruin. Legal prosecution remained consistently difficult due to First Amendment protections of religious expression, creating a legal environment where fraudulent preachers could exploit constitutional protections to avoid accountability. Prosecutors struggled to prove criminal intent when defendants claimed sincere religious belief, even when evidence clearly demonstrated systematic deception and financial exploitation. The psychological manipulation techniques used across all cases involved exploiting fundamental human needs for hope, meaning, and divine intervention during crisis situations. These fraudsters weaponized faith itself, turning spiritual desperation into criminal opportunity while hiding behind religious authority and constitutional protections. Investigative journalism played a crucial role in exposing these frauds, with media investigations providing the public scrutiny and evidence gathering that law enforcement often couldn't accomplish. Cases like Tilton's prayer request scam and Popoff's electronic deception were revealed through dedicated investigative reporting that protected countless potential victims from ongoing exploitation. 10 men who weaponized faith to build empires of deception and exploitation, proving that some of the most dangerous criminals wear clerical collars and speak in tongues while picking pockets and breaking hearts. From Creflo Dollar's shameless $65 million jet request to Peter Popoff's high-tech divine revelation fraud, these cases expose how spiritual authority can become the perfect cover for systematic criminal enterprise. Some of these fraudulent preachers continue their ministries today, still exploiting vulnerable believers despite being exposed as charlatans. Others faced legal consequences or public disgrace, but the patterns they established continue to influence new generations of religious fraudsters who study their methods and adapt their techniques for modern audiences. The most shocking aspect isn't just the scale of their deception, but the brazen audacity with which they exploited humanity's deepest spiritual needs for personal profit. These weren't crimes of passion or desperation. They were calculated, systematic operations designed to extract maximum wealth from the most vulnerable members of society while hiding behind religious freedom protections. Their victims weren't just robbed of money, they were stripped of faith, hope, and trust in spiritual authority. Families bankrupted themselves, seeking miraculous intervention that never came, while terminally ill patients abandoned medical treatment for false promises of divine healing that led to unnecessary deaths. Which scandal shocked you most? The $65 million private jet funded by struggling congregation members? Or Amy Semple McPherson's fake kidnapping to cover up her affair? Was it Todd Bentley's violent healing sessions that left followers injured? Or Robert Tilton's prayer requests thrown in dumpsters while he kept the donations? These cases remind us that the greatest betrayals often come from those we trust most, and that religious authority can become the most effective weapon for exploiting human vulnerability. The combination of spiritual desperation and constitutional protection creates the perfect environment for sophisticated fraud that destroys lives while enriching criminals. Subscribe to Savage Case Files for more investigations into betrayals that shattered the trust of millions, where we expose the dark reality behind institutions and authority figures who exploit the very people they claim to serve. 10 preachers who proved that the greatest sinners sometimes stand behind pulpits, turning houses of worship into crime scenes and divine promises into criminal schemes. This has been Savage Case Files, where faith meets fraud and sacred trust becomes criminal opportunity.